Hi, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I'm here with Dyer Supplier to demonstrate how you can kettle dye a semi-solid yarn using Jacquard acid dyes. We will be dyeing 200 grams of the Dyer Supplier Superwash Worsted Merino yarn base. This is 100% superwash merino with 215 yards per 100 grams of yarn. Acid dyes are great for adding color to wool-based yarns. You want a protein-based fiber, wool, alpaca, silk, cashmere. These dyes won't work very well on cellulose fibers like cotton or synthetics like acrylic or polyester. Since we are using commercial acid dyes, all of the equipment and tools that we are using in this video are dedicated dye tools and are not used for food. In this video, we are going to mix our Dyebath directly from the Jacquard Brilliant Blue dye powder. Jacquard acid dyes come in 40 different colors, and you can find the complete selection of colors on the Dyer Supplier website. I like to add a removable zip tie to my yarn. As an extra tie, I find it comes in really handy. We are going to pre-soak our yarn in some plain tap water to make sure all of the fibers are wet for 20 to 30 minutes. Whenever I'm dealing with dry acid dye powder, I'm always wearing a respirator, safety glasses, and I like to wear some nitrile gloves. Today we are going to dye our yarn at a 1% depth of shade, or DOS, which means that we want 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn.
Measuring dyes out by weight is much more accurate than measuring them out by volume. Okay, so here we've got about a half teaspoon, and that is about 1.4 grams. Add a little more because we're going to want 2 grams of dye. Okay, so about 3/4 of a teaspoon are approximately equivalent to 2 grams of dye of the Brilliant Blue. It is more accurate to measure out dye weight versus volume because the weight to volume ratio can vary between different colors of dye. Therefore, for the most accurate, reproducible results, I recommend getting some kind of kitchen scale for weighing out your dye powders. For a well-dissolved dye, you want to add water to dye and not the other way around. So to start off, I'm just going to add a tiny bit of water and paste up this dye. I'm really trying to make sure that any chunks are broken up and that everything is wet. And slowly, little by little, we can add some more hot tap water so we can dissolve this dye. Since we're not making a stock solution, the actual final volume that we end up with is not as important because we're planning to dye until exhaustion. So all of this dye will end up on our 200 grams of yarn by the time we're done with this project. However, I am dissolving this 2 grams of dye in about 1 cup of water.
Now that the dye has all been dissolved, I can take off the face mask and become a lot less muffled. Now we can go and set up our dye bath. In my 8-quart stainless steel pot, I have 16 cups of water, and I'm going to start heating things up. I am on my gas stove top. I'm going to add 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. The proportion of 2 tablespoons of vinegar to 8 cups of water is a proportion I like to use a lot, especially with 100 grams of yarn, and I've just doubled it here today. While things are heating up and are still relatively cool, I'm going to go ahead and add our dye today. You can see that we were able to get it to dissolve really, really well, but with the technique we're doing, there's no harm in letting the dye bath heat up with all of the dye in it. I like to try to keep my dye baths at just below a boil or at a very light simmer. So a lot of times I will heat the dye bath up until I see bubbles, and that's when we will add our yarn. The dye bath is just starting to boil, so I'm going to reduce the heat. I have removed our yarn from the pre-soak, and I squeezed out most of the water so that way it is wet but not dripping. And before I add the yarn to the pot, I will have a pair of dedicated dye tongs here so that way I can help move the yarn around in the pot to help us get color coverage all over. And now let's put the yarn in very quickly, and I am moving it a bit. The color coverage is not going to be perfectly even. There will be variation in here. There are going to be spots where the color will strike more or less. If you want more variation, have dry yarn added in and don't move it once you put it in. For less variation, add your yarn to the pot while the dye bath is completely cool and have no acid in there. So that way you can really slow down the rate of absorption of color. But now I want to bring up the heat a bit again. But look at that beautiful color. And you can already see some of the tonal variation that we have because some areas are grabbing more color than others. And let's see, in just that little bit of time, this color is striking quickly, which is wonderful. And we are going to go ahead and let this sit. I'm going to reduce the heat to low to keep us below a boil, but don't freak out if you do see some bubbles. It can get to a rolling boil and the yarn will still be fine. But I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for 20 minutes and then we'll be back and check in on our yarn. Okay, we've got some bubbling and let's check the dye bath. There's still some blue in there. Most is definitely in our yarn, but we do want to give a little more time. If we look at the spoon, you can barely see the color. But what we can do also is go ahead and add a little more acid. 2, 3, 4. We've just doubled the amount of white vinegar by adding 4 more tablespoons. Just lifting this up by the ties to help mix that around. And I'm actually going to turn off the heat and let this start cooling in the pot. That way the yarn can absorb more of the color. After a little over 20 minutes, the dye bath is still warm, but the water has cleared. So now I'm taking the yarn out of the dye bath. I'm going to set it aside to cool so then we can wash it. Our yarn has cooled and now we are going to wash it in some cool tap water. If the yarn is still slightly warm, I try to match the temperature of the tap water to the temperature of the yarn, but the yarn is currently room temperature. I'm going to add a little bit of clear dish soap, which I like to do as a form of a bleed test. Sometimes the introduction of soap can cause some bleeding, and if bleeding is going to happen, we want to know. But we're good, and our water is clear. So I'm now going to go ahead and rinse out the soap, hang the yarn up to dry, and we'll come back for some conclusions. Here is our finished dry semi-solid yarn. This yarn is predominantly a saturated medium blue color, but there are some hits of lighter and darker patches because of the overall technique that we went for. For this project, we measured out 2 grams of dye because we wanted to use 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. But if I wanted to dye 4 skeins and have them be all the same colorway, it could be worthwhile to make up a dye stock and then measure out the amount of liquid dye we want to use for the project. So, for example, we could measure out 5 grams of dye and dissolve it in 500 milliliters of water. And then we would take 200 milliliters of that solution to give us the 2 grams for the same color that we saw here. Dye stocks can last a really long time at room temperature, but my personal preference for the most accurate reproducible colors is to mix them as fresh as I can and to use them quickly. Today we created a stunning semi-solid yarn with a kettle dyeing technique. If you want a color that is a little more on the solid side, then start off with a cool dye bath and no vinegar. Add your pre-soaked yarn to the bath with the dye, mix things around and slowly bring it up to temperature, adding the vinegar once it is hot. This allows you to get more even coverage, so you will get something that is more solid overall. Then if you want something that is more variegated, you want more semi to the solid, set up your dye bath, add a little more vinegar, and then try adding the yarn to the pot dry. You'll find that you'll get a lot of different levels of saturation of the color that you mixed on your yarn. I hope you all enjoyed this video on how to dye a semi-solid yarn with jacquard acid dyes. If you want to watch me dye some more yarn, you can find me on the Chemknits Tutorials YouTube channel. You can find a link in the video description. Make sure you head over and check out the Dyer Supplier website for more affordable, beautiful bare yarn that takes up dye beautifully. And you can also find all 40 jacquard acid dye colors over there. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.